Welcome to Zonie Living. I'm Bonnie Stevens. Today we are taking a deep and straightforward dive into the messy anatomy of divorce. If divorce were a disease, I believe it would be called a full-on pandemic. Statistics show that almost half of all marriages in the United States will end in divorce or separation. But perhaps for the first time, we have a real understanding of how likely a marriage will be in crisis and how to fix or not to fix the underlying causes. Marriage and family therapist and life coach Dr. Becky Whetstone lays it all out for us in this groundbreaking new book, I Think I Want Out: What to Do When One of You Wants to End Your Marriage. Dr. Whetstone is known as America's marriage crisis counselor. She joins us now from Arkansas.
Hi, Bonnie.
Hi, Dr. Whetstone. I am so excited to talk to you today. Your book is just incredible and brave, and I'm so honored that I got to read it. But as I was reading it, I kept shaking my head and wondering, where have you been? In your book, you describe the chaos and the ugliness of a marriage in crisis. There's often anger, hurt, confusion, resentment. One person, as you describe so beautifully, may be demanding a divorce, while the other is fighting to keep the union together. And the default mode for couples trying to manage this really painful time, I would call it nothing short of insane. Usually there's no logical steps. There's no agreement about spending or living arrangements or seeing other people. And most importantly, as you point out, parenting. And no timeline about what should happen next. So you bravely use your divorce as an example, saying, why couldn't a marriage therapist help us? I thought that too. And when you said that, I thought, hallelujah. You said your divorce was so traumatic that you began your journey into understanding and dissecting a marriage in crisis. Tell us what you've seen.
Well, it bothered me that the marriage therapist couldn't help us at all. I mean, he literally, when he said, if you don't want to work on the marriage, there's nothing I can do. And he sent us off into the ether.
Oh, yikes.
To make a mess, because, we didn't know what the hell we were doing.
No.
And our nervous systems were kicked up, and my husband especially was in a very fearful mode, and so he was lashing out and doing things that made me want to leave him even more.
For sure.
And we just had no one coaching us, no one telling us what to do, and I believe we ended up prematurely divorced when and then left with the question of, what could have been done? Was there anything that could have been done? And then, it really helps that many years have passed since then, and I've gotten to see how all four of us, me, my husband, and my two children, how we fared in 30 years since, and you can't predict some of these things that, how your divorce is going to affect your lives for many, many years to come. But I went to graduate school about 12 years after the divorce, and spent 5 years there. And whenever I was able to do my own research, I researched marriage crisis, divorce, separation, digging in the library and through articles and books about what could have been done. And I found a treasure trove. I found so much information on marriage crisis, and it just drove me crazy that marriage therapy, this information is buried away in books. No one's talking about it. And why isn't it common knowledge for marriage therapists? And in fact, I just, for the first time, presented on this subject at the Texas Association of Marriage and Family Therapists in Austin a couple of weeks ago. And the therapists ran up to me after the presentation, and they're like, you're right. They don't train us in this. We don't know what we're doing. This is filling a void that our profession has just sort of left dormant all these years. So I've created a way to help couples from the moment that the crisis begins all the way through the entire process till final decisions are made. And then once they make their decisions, we help them implement them and oversee it so that they are doing the healthiest possible decision making and behaviors so their family can be successful all the way through it and beyond.
Oh, you certainly do. I can so read that through your book. Let's talk about childhood trauma. Now,
Mhm.
you've worked with thousands of clients, and you say, I've never met anyone who doesn't have childhood developmental trauma. I find that shocking, but believable. So, would you explain what childhood trauma looks like and how it's affecting us as grown-ups, and then what we can do to help ourselves?
Absolutely. Okay, so it's very easy for a child to become traumatized. Okay. And that's anytime they get their feelings hurt, or anytime they're
Mm,
disappointed or frustrated, or don't get the toy at the store. All these things can be traumatizing. In fact, the definition of what traumatizes a child is anything that happened in childhood that was less than nurturing. So,
that's a
so,
lot. That's a lot
just
of
think of,
things.
and not only within our families, but, not getting invited to the birthday party, or
Mm,
thinking that the little girl over there doesn't like you. And, just so many situations, not being good in school, not being able to spell, all these things are
sure.
traumatizing to a child. And so we've got our family traumatizing us, usually unintentionally. And then the friendships and situations that we encounter. And then our culture does it by setting high expectations of us,
Sure.
whether it's through your religion or school or athletics or whatever the situation is. There's all these bars that we're expected to hit. And then a child realizes early on that they can never hit those bars enough. So we make a decision that we're not good enough when that happens. And when we decide we're not good enough, most of us come up with kind of crazy fake personas that we start living through instead, because we're saying to ourselves, well, if I become a pleaser, and if I'm in a good mood all the time and I don't bother anybody, then I won't get in trouble. So I won't have to experience the pain of that. And then everyone will like me and life will go very well for me.
Oh boy.
And other people decide they need to be an overachiever or a perfectionist or a caretaker or a knight in shining armor, or whatever persona it is that they take on that makes them feel like they're enough. But it's fake, that's the crazy part. Now, where the rubber meets the pavement in adulthood too is in our interpersonal relationships, mostly with our significant other. Emotional immaturity shows up in how we speak to each other, how we communicate, how we deal with things. And so that it's the emotional immaturity that comes from having been traumatized in childhood that we carry
Mm.
into adulthood, and it just destroys our relationships. So I'm basically teaching couples daily how to grow up and be adults in their relationships. And having a good relationship is a learned skill. You cannot wing it. You have to be taught how to do it. So almost all these successful, super smart people that I'm working with, they are at the kindergarten or less level when it comes to having relationship skills.
You know, you
Literally, just starting at the preschool level.
You mentioned that in the book, and I've wondered that as well. Why things like that aren't taught to us as we're growing up. It's something we just have to stumble through, and most of us not very well.
It drives me crazy. I have
I bet it.
a lot of feelings about the fact that our culture leaves us high and dry.
Hmm.
And most of our role models were misguided at best. And really, many of my clients, their parents were hopelessly dysfunctional, even though they may have been successful in their careers, or, going about their daily business. They were still very dysfunctional and taught their children very dysfunctional thinking and ways of being.
So we're not
So I feel
alone.
like I feel like I have to undo all these. It's like they come to me all tied up in a knot, and I have to sit there with all the little strings and untie everything.
You must have a lot of patience for your job.
I'm
You,
just fascinated by it. I don't know
oh,
why. I just am.
well, it is fascinating, and as you say, it's everywhere. You also emphasize that our responsibility is taking care of ourselves. Another thing we don't do very well. You write, learning to nurture yourself is one of the best medicines available. So, Dr. Whetstone, how do we do this?
Okay, so, if I make a request to my husband to take me to the movie tonight, and he says he really doesn't want to do that. That's his right to tell me that. And so I may be disappointed in that. And so if you think about it, I have a wounded little girl inside who's all sad because she's not going to go to the movie tonight.
Mm,
And I need to take care of her. So I literally ask myself, Becky, what would make you feel better? And I'm thinking, well, I might like to have a girly night, in the bathtub with some candles and some nice music and, you know, having some primping time and, just time to myself and taking care of myself. But it's really like doing things that comfort you, doing things that make you feel better. And you can even do things like hug yourself. There's a known somatic technique of putting your hand on your opposite shoulder and your other one under your arm, kind of by your armpit, and your body's got all these nerves that run down from your brain down to your torso, the vagus nerve, and when your body responds to human touch. So, you can even when you're feeling kind of really vulnerable, even holding your head like your head needed to be held when you were an infant, and it just needed support. But you just sort of follow your intuition about where you might need to put your hands on your body, and the vagus nerve responds to it and it calms you down. Another great technique is to calm yourself down, is just to, you know, notice your breathing, how many times you're breathing in a minute. I'd like to see people work their way down to 10 or 8 breaths a minute when they're trying to relax themselves. The breath does wonders and miracles for lowering anxiety and making people feel better. So don't hesitate to take care of yourself like you would your own child.
I love that. Great tips. When we are all in that love state, though, we're not thinking about the work. We're not taking care of ourselves necessarily, but we're not also thinking about the work of marriage. Help us understand what that work of marriage is all about and what makes a good partner. What makes us a good partner?
I used to have a sign when I had an office that said, "Ask not what your marriage can do for you, but ask what you can do for your marriage." So
I
I
like that.
like to think of it as sort of a giving proposition. I think a lot of people are thinking of marriage as what they're going to get out of it,
Hmm.
and they're keeping count. You hadn't done this for me, you hadn't done that for.
Ooh,
But I think
yes.
that, it's best to approach it by looking at your spouse and saying, how can I enhance your life today? And do that on a daily basis. And the truth is, the book, The Five Love Languages, is one of the most profound things written for couples that ever existed. When my friends get married, I give them a copy of it
Oh, good
and
idea.
I tell them to read this, take it to heart, and do it every day for the rest of your marriage. So you find out what your partner's love language is, and then you do that for them in the way that they need it. The way they've got to describe to you exactly what, how they like that. And then you do those things, and don't waste your time doing the things that don't make them feel loved by you.
Mm,
And so do the things that do make them feel loved, and it kind of keeps their heart singing for
yeah.
you, keeps the fire stoked. But if you just get busy with your career and your kids and your chores and cleaning the house and all that kind of stuff, then and you don't tend to your marriage, it will absolutely begin to die, and it will go from, let's say, the summer where it was all warm to the winter time where it's cold and distant. And so it's just so important that we put the time in. I think of, tending to my marriage as sort of having another job,
Mm-hmm.
and I really have to make time for it. My husband loves me to cook for him. So I may see clients all day and be writing a book, but I am most days going to hop upstairs at a certain point and cook a meal because he loves it so much. He just
Mm.
loves my cooking and he loves home cooked meals. So, you know, um, that's what I'm talking about, is showing the person that you love them and you want them to be happy.
Yeah, I guess it's all about not taking people for granted and that has to be nurtured and fed. to
Oh
keep things
no,
going.
no. You show them that
Yeah.
the wedding vows are so good. Whoever wrote them was a genius. To love is the love languages. To honor is to respect, meaning you keep the way you speak to your spouse at a certain high level.
Mm,
And then cherish as you treat them as if that you value them.
yeah.
So through your words and through your actions.
Yeah. Good words.
So, if you do the love languages and really do what the vows say, you're going to be like in the top 1% of
That's
rock star spouses.
great advice. Well, here's something that it seems few people want an honest answer to, and yet you put it out there. Should every marriage be saved? Now, to me, this is one of the most valuable parts of your book. I believe the knowledge you share can save us years, maybe even decades, of being stuck in a dysfunctional situation and maybe indecision. Well, let's talk about mental disorders. You discuss also the cycle of abuse and how you've witnessed how hard it is for a woman to leave a charming partner. I found all of that fascinating. Let's
Yes.
discuss.
I just knew when I was planning this book that this is not Disneyland here. This
Mm,
book is real, and it faces it. Marriages have real problems.
yeah.
And unfortunately, if I ever get an exit interview when I die with the divine source, I'm going to ask, why we had to have mental disorders as much as we do. And most people will experience some sort of mental disorder. 20%, that is, will experience some sort of mental disorder during the year.
Wow.
10% of people have mood disorders like depression and anxiety. Those are treatable and fixable. Bipolar disorder is treatable and fixable. I think it's actually higher than 10%
Mm,
myself. I think if
okay.
if you went to Walmart and everyone on antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs had a star on their forehead, you'd see an awful lot of stars.
Why couldn't it be that easy?
So I just, those stats are pretty low.
Yeah.
And then, the booger bears in marriage and marriage crisis are number one, if you do have a mood disorder and you're not having it treated,
Mm-hmm.
then, your spouse is going to be unhappy. I'm just telling you, like you need, if you have mood disorders like depression and anxiety, you need to go straight to your doctor and deal with them head on and get in therapy. Getting on medications and getting psychotherapy are the most effective ways of treating those. And there's no excuse for languishing in it and letting it affect your entire family. But the ones that I see too much of, because if you're in marriage crisis, there's, marriages that struggle have a high proportion of people with personality disorders. These are what we call axis 2 disorders in the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists have developed. And they are personality disorders like antisocial personality disorder, narcissism, borderline personality disorder, obsessive compulsive, and narcissism. Did I say that one?
Yes.
Histrionic. So there's they are they're like autism or mental retardation in that they're finite. Like if you have autism, you might can have therapies that will improve your outcome, but you will always be autistic, and that's
Mm,
the way it is. Same thing with mental retardation. If you have a personality disorder, your disorder of your personality will always exist and is not treatable or fixable. You can manage it if you try real hard. However, one of the biggest problems with a personality disordered person is they won't admit that there's anything wrong with them. If you won't admit there's anything wrong with you, you won't get help for it.
right.
So they're very difficult people to deal with. They can be very volatile,
Mm,
very shaming type of people. And I could talk about them all day long, but in the population, that's about 10% of the population has a personality disorder. I think it's higher. But in marriage crisis management work like I do, I would say that 20% of the time I'm dealing with somebody with a personality disorder. And they are so difficult to work with. They're resistant to taking responsibility for their actions. So you can't, Dr. Phil used to say, you can't fix what you won't acknowledge, and they will not acknowledge being part of the problem. They are pointing, they're blamers. They point the finger at their spouse or there's, or the spouse's dad or whatever, but it's never them. They're never part of the problem. And if you start telling them that, hey, you're part of the problem, most often they fire you. I mean, they think that you don't know what you're talking about, and that's just a part of the marriage therapist's job. Is we get fired a lot by people with personality disorders. And usually they probably think they're punishing us, and they don't realize that it's actually a day of
A
joy.
blessing, I'm sure. Well, as you've been talking, so you take a pleaser and you take a narcissist, and for some reason they are attracted to each other. And so the narcissist keeps hammering on the pleaser, and the pleaser keeps trying harder and harder. Is that kind of how it goes? Have you seen that?
It is extremely common combination. There's so many pleasers out there. I mean, it's
Sure.
just epidemic. I'm a recovered pleaser myself, and my kid's dad was a narcissist. And I just couldn't, I could not hit the bar to meet his approval. And so, it was an exercise in complete and total frustration. If he'd had been affectionate and given me some love instead of criticizing me, I think, we might could have stayed married. But he was mean, and I couldn't stay with the meanness of it. And controlling. Like, he and I were on different political spectrums, and if I voted for someone that he disapproved of, he would dock my allowance, for example.
Boy.
I was a housewife at the time, when I was married to him, so I got an allowance.
As crazy as that sounds, I understand it. I've seen it. When you were talking about that you're a recovered pleaser, I really like that term. I think that's
Yes.
super, I think that's very effective. And that's something that pleasers years ago were not told that's not a healthy thing. And people talked about boundaries, but I think there was so much confusion about what's not normal. And I've talked, right? And I've talked to friends of mine that actually wished they had been struck by their spouse, because then they would understand that was wrong. But anything like, controlling behavior, manipulation, sarcasm, being talked down to, the emotional and the mental abuse was not real. It was not that crystal clear. But once you get hit,
what you're talking about is, in marriage, there's parking ticket crimes, there's speeding ticket crimes, there's lower grade felonies. There's, serious felonies, and then there's capital crimes, And so I think that when someone's in a marriage and they're having a bunch of parking tickets and speeding tickets and maybe not felonies, then they doubt that they have merit to walk away. But, I've written in my blog before and talk about it a lot, is that those are the marriages that die a death by 1,000 cuts. It's just because over time, when your spouse isn't responsive to your requests and they just don't seem to respect your wishes and all that kind of stuff, just over time, you realize that maybe you're not in a partnership.
yeah.
And then, so then why do I need this person who's like a dead weight in my life, and they're not enhancing my life? Not only they're dragging me down,
Yeah.
So those are those kind of marriages. And I tell people like that, you better wake up, because if your spouse is making a reasonable request of you, you better be responsive. That is how the the more minor kind of parking ticket, speeding ticket things end up in divorce court is because the spouse isn't responsive.
Okay, well, you talk about 3 marital felonies in your book.
Mhm.
Let's talk about those.
They're the 3 A's:
Okay.
adultery, abuse, and addiction. And, I see all of those all the time. I see them a lot in my work. I see them a lot in my work. And yes, I wanted to also say that, I myself, but way back in the day, used to doubt whether my concerns in my marriage had merit. And I just really wanted to tell your listeners, when I went and read the book, The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck, and then later in my professional career, I found the work of Pia Mellody, who wrote Facing Codependence, and then the work of Terry Real for couples, who is created relational life therapy. He has an audio book called Fierce Intimacy. I'll tell you what, if you read those books, it tells you what it is to be a healthy adult. It tells you what it is to be healthy in a relationship so that you won't have to doubt yourself anymore. You will absolutely know what healthy boundaries are. You will absolutely know, you'll be able to know exactly when someone's offending you or doing things they shouldn't have done. And so those books changed my life. And I did train with Pia Mellody. I trained with Terry Real. And I can't even tell you how profound their ideas are for being a healthy adult and healthy in relationships.
I really appreciate that. And in your book, you cite resources and books to
Yes.
read, and I find that really helpful as well. How do we navigate a marriage in crisis in the most caring and painless way, which is really what your work seems to come down to?
Well, there's going to be pain. There's
Yeah,
going to be pain. You can't do it painlessly, number one. So, I think people come to you freaking out.
sure.
The person who I call the decider, who's thinking of leaving, wants to run away, and the person who is the leaning in partner and wants to save the marriage is in the fight and fix mode. So they're chasing after the decider and trying to pull them back in the marriage, and they may be love bombing them and all that kind of stuff. And ironically, that the more the leaning in partner chases the decider when they're trying to get away, the more the decider will run toward divorce. So the first thing I do is, first of all, normalize for them that what they're going through is what every single couple who goes into marriage crisis goes through. Every single couple. 600 divorces in America in a year. And I'm thinking about all the marriages that went in marriage crisis in a year that didn't end in divorce. So it's probably way over 1 million couples a year are going into marriage crisis, and they're freaking out, and their nervous systems are kicked up, and they are in the fight, flight, and freeze response, and they cannot make wise decisions when their physiology is in that mode. And so I tell them, look, we're not going to make any important decisions right now. We're going to press pause here, and we're going to work initially on getting each of you guys calmed down. And I do an assessment of the marriage because I need to know if the decider needs space. If the leaning in partner won't leave them alone, won't stop chasing them, or won't stop attacking them, or whatever it is they're doing, then we need to probably separate them so that the decider can get space. Because if they cannot get space and breathing room and get calmed down, then they will certainly opt for divorce early in the process. And I'm trying to, sort through things. So it's almost like we're in the middle of a huge disaster, and I'm wanting the climax of the disaster to pass, to kind of, it's like after a tornado and people walk around the neighborhood and see what happened. I need, I need, you know, for things to calm down, then we can go out in the street and see what we have and assess everything. And that's when I get to know, I'm going to be looking to see if they have mental disorders. I'm going to be looking to see the things that have happened in the marriage that have done so much damage. And I'll be able to give them insight into, what their options are, what I recommend for them. And if they have children, I'm going to be pressing on them pretty heavily to be respectful and very slow in the process. Just slow things down. There's no hurry or rush to end a marriage. And, let's just make sure we know what we're doing. And this comes from, my own experience, but also in the research, I have found that couples need to be able to tell themselves, I did everything I could to save my marriage before they opt for divorce.
Yes.
So this process gives them that peace of mind that they did everything they could, whether they reconcile, separate, or divorce. So
yeah, such great advice. You don't want to have any regrets or think you did something too quickly.
no.
When you talk about separated, you talk about in your book, you say when somebody asks for some time to themselves, that they want to be separated, you acknowledge that sends shockwaves to the other person, the leaning in person.
Oh yes.
And so that's a hard one to sell. But when you're saying it, when a couple is sitting there and you're talking to them, it's not necessarily the decider's decision that's pushing that. So I think that's so healthy to have a third person explain. This just gives us all a timeout and gets us able to sort through some things. And is that kind of how that works?
Yeah, I mean, even at the conference a couple of weeks ago, I told the other therapists that, I once had a leaning in partner walk in my office, and the first thing they said was, I hate you, Dr. Becky, because you talk about separation.
Yikes.
And I don't want a separation.
Right.
And really no leaning in partner wants a separation. They are violently opposed to it, and they make up all these meanings that it's the first step to divorce. How will they know if I'm changing if they live away from me? They have all these stock phrases that I hear over and over and over again. And I tell them that I don't recommend the separation route for everyone. Okay, for sure. I recommend it for the ones that will absolutely end in divorce if they don't do it.
Gotcha. Okay.
So things are really, really bad at that point, and it's their only hope.
Well, when you talk about the 3 marital felonies, I think it's important to point out that marriages can get past those, but it's very, very hard work, right?
Well, the 75% of marriages survive infidelity.
That's amazing.
And there's actually, and I think I do mention this in my book, there's best case scenario infidelities and just the most egregious, awful scenarios. And so, the kind of infidelity it is important. And obviously if there's addiction involved and the person goes and gets treatment and goes into a 12-step program and is really working it with a sponsor, that would be a best case scenario situation. I have many people that try to behaviorally control their drug use or their alcohol, and I am very pessimistic when somebody's trying to do it that way. And on the abuse thing though, I know from having interned at the Family Violence Center in San Antonio when I was in graduate school, that the odds of a person who is abusive changing are so minuscule that you could almost say they can't change. They won't change. I mean, it's extremely rare. And one of the reasons is because most people who are abusive have a personality disorder.
Okay.
And those people don't change and they don't accept responsibility. And they're exceedingly immature and controlling usually. And so, I tell a lot of people, like, you really need to think long and hard about whether you want to stay with somebody who abuses you. That's not going to change. And the other thing is, they may verbally abuse you, emotionally abuse you, shove you, or whatever, or maybe they've never laid a hand on you, but we know that if a person verbally or emotionally abuses you, they're absolutely capable of physically abusing you and even killing you. So, that's a subject that should be taken extremely seriously.
What a powerful statement, Dr. Whetstone, and I so appreciate you delivering that loudly and clearly. I think you said 600,000 divorces in the United States happens every year, and that doesn't even count the ones that
Yeah,
should already be divorced
they're
or that are
miserable.
separated or that we don't hear about. Paint a picture for what a healthy marriage, a committed relationship might look like. You've talked about some other resources, and you've talked about our love languages, but if you could just, put it in a nice nutshell for us about what that looks like.
You know, Number one thing is they're kind and respectful to each
I
other.
love that.
Their fighting style is to laugh things off. I think, I tell some of my clients who take themselves so seriously, they can't take any teasing or anything. You need to get over yourself. Like, if you can't laugh at yourself, that would be a red flag to me that you're going to be difficult in marriage, because
Mm.
couples tease each other. That's normal, and we should be able to do that without it causing a dust up. But Sue Johnson was a huge influence in our field. She created emotionally focused therapy, and she thought that attachment was super important to a marriage. And she said these three ingredients, which I mention in my book, the flour, cake, the flour, eggs, and milk that go in a cake, are accessibility, which is, we've got to have a sense that our spouse is there for us, is reachable, is accessible. If we need them, they'll be there. They'll stand by our side. Number two, responsiveness. And that's what I was saying earlier is, people, if your spouse is making a reasonable request, be responsive by all means. I mean, this is so important. And then engagement is the third thing, which is, you can just see when couples are engaged with each other. They're very into each other. My husband went with me he's retired, and he went with me to the conference last week. And when I was in meetings, he was sitting out at the table, answering people's questions about my marriage crisis management training and my book. And I just fell in love with him all over again,
Aw.
because there he was being a support to me. He didn't have to be there. It was elective for him to be there. And that he showed up and was a true partner in that moment was a super bonding moment. Like I said, it just made me love him even more. So it's things like that where you're showing up and showing your spouse. Like, my husband read my book. He listens to these podcasts. He watches me on Instagram. He's engaged in what Becky's doing, and he brags about me to his family and friends.
Mm.
And that's the kind of stuff that, the loyalty to one another, having each other's back, is huge, absolutely huge. So, showing through your actions that your spouse is your priority, it's very powerful. It builds bonds.
I love it when I hear a man talk about his spouse or his partner in a way
Ew.
that they're so proud of them. They're just glowing about them. They're number one champion, and that
It is so true. It's
it
very
makes us.
attractive. And like, when you see other men do it, it's just like, wow, that's fantastic. Right. Yes.
Well, Dr. Becky Whetstone, I want to thank you so much for being here and for all the years of work you've done to understand marriages in crisis. You are no doubt helping couples everywhere, and your intelligent and brave new book is really a must read. I don't care if you've been through a divorce already or if you're a teenager. I think it's got such good information in it, and I so
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
So thank you
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Dr. Becky Whetstone's new book, I Think I Want Out: What to Do When One of You Wants to End Your Marriage, offers the most valuable and matter-of-fact information I've ever seen for understanding the causes and symptoms of a marriage in crisis. I Think I Want Out guides us to navigate this period with purpose and compassion, with the least amount of damage to each other, to family, to friends, and most importantly, to the children involved. The book is packed with knowledge, but also is a workbook with worksheets and charts, and even the managed separation agreement template, which she created. You can reach Dr. Whetstone at marriagecrisismanager.com. I hope you have gained some valuable relationship insight, and that we will all put into practice the part about taking care of ourselves, especially during difficult and confusing times. This is Zonie Living, Business, Adventure, and Leadership. I'm Bonnie Stevens.